Hey, this is Joe Hubbard from JoeHubbardBassVideos.com, coming at you today with another lesson. And this is the 5th lesson in my jazz improvisation course, Creating Jazz Lines. This particular lesson is on the diminished 7th chord, so with that in mind, grab your bass and let's get started. The diminished 7th chord is built symmetrically, meaning the distance between each tone is of equal distance. And in this case, it's minor thirds. So between the root and the third, there's a minor third interval. Between the 3 and the 5, there's a minor third. Between the 5 and the 7th, there's a minor third. And then between the 7th going back to the root, there's a minor third. So what happens when you hear a diminished 7th chord, there's no way to tell what inversion it's in, because if you start inverting the chords, it just becomes another diminished 7th chord. It just replicates itself and becomes another diminished 7th chord, a minor third up. So it becomes a very weak chord harmonically, because you can't really identify the root without some sort of clue. So harmonically, as a standalone chord, the diminished 7th chord functions as a chord that is generally known as a passing chord that is sandwiched in between two strong tonal chords. So a good example is that you could have like C major 7, then you have C sharp diminished 7th, and then you have D minor 7th. This would be an example of that. Where you'd have the 1 major 7th chord and then the 2 minor 7th chord, and right in between there you have a diminished 7th chord, which is creating basically a chromatic bass line, and therefore it has a bit of glue because it resolves back to a strong tonal chord. The way we'll really apply this chord is in the 90 percentile, is going to be as a superimposition over a dominant 7th chord. That's really the way it's used most of all. Now and again we see it as a passing chord and we have to understand, but generally those chords go by so quick as well that we really want to look at this as a diminished idea superimposed over the dominant 7th chord. So with that in mind, when we analyze a C diminished 7th chord, what we're going to end up with is C, we've got the E flat, we've got the G flat, and then we've got the A. This is the root, the flat 3, the flat 5, and the double flat 7. Now, technically, if that was a double flat 7, we'd want to call it B double flat. But really, for the purpose of us applying this in a real-time musical scenario, it's easier to adjust the enharmonic and just think of that as an A, so we're not thinking of double flats. You need to know the theory behind this, that it is a double flat 7, because when we employ the scale that goes over this, you'll see the scale actually has a natural 7 in it as well, and this has a double flat 7. So the thing is it's just one of those things. But when you apply it, it's quite acceptable to alter that enharmonic so it just becomes that natural note, or it just remains in whatever key you're in, either a natural note, a flat, or a sharp, and you don't have to deal with thinking about double flats and double sharps. So the idea is that when I play this C diminished 7th chord, if we play it here, where I have, because there's another fingering for it, what I want you to see is the difference between this C diminished 7th chord and a B dominant 7th chord that's a half step below. Okay? You'll note that if we have this C diminished 7th chord, I've got C, I've got the E flat, I've got the G flat, and I've got the A. The B dominant 7th chord, I've got the B, the D sharp, the F sharp, and the A. There's only one note that's different, and that's either the B and the C. It's between the B and the C. So the idea is that the way we want to really use this is a superimposition over a B dominant 7th chord, or the dominant 7th chord a half step below the actual root of the diminished chord. Now, the thing is that, you know how I said when you invert this diminished 7th chord, you just end up with another diminished seventh chord. What happens here in the application is superimposing it. I can superimpose it from that flat 9 vantage point, which is what I just originally showed you. But I can also superimpose the inversions of those, and that's going to be from the 3rd. I can play that from the 5th, or from the flat 7 of that B dominant 7th chord to get that sound, which is that flat 9 sound, because that's really the only difference between the two, is that we don't have a root in there, we've got the flat 9 in there, okay? And that creates that nice character of that 5-to-1 resolution in a minor key area. Let's start this lesson off by reviewing the 2-octave diminished 7th arpeggio. Remember what we had before. We had this fingering pattern. And at first grasp of this arpeggio, because the sound is hard to latch onto, because it's very ambiguous, the diminished sound, is that you might think that it's harder than it actually is, because the fingering patterns are all symmetrical, they're all equal distance. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because because it's hard to hear, you need to really be able to pay attention to what chord tones you're on. But because the fingerings actually fall on the fretboard quite easily, it's easy to rely just on these fingering patterns. And I don't want you to do that, because you'll get yourself in trouble at some point. So when you go through this, it's really important to really be aware of what all the chord tones are when you're playing these. I want you to go through all the different keys, and I want you to mentally talk your way through, like the root, flat 3, 5, or flat 5 and double flat 7, and after a while you can just go, knowing that the formula is root, flat 3, flat 5, double flat 7, just say root 3, 5, 7. It's easier to think on the fly, but you know that formula down pat. Okay, so it's the consequence of the fingering patterns being symmetrical is a positive one, because a lot of the patterns that we've been through in the previous lessons, the diatonic approach from above, the chromatic from below, when we mix those, the rhythmical patterns with the 3-note patterns, ascending, descending, these will actually probably be a little bit easier, because it falls into the fingers a little bit easier on the fretboard. But, as I said, it's a double-edged sword, because sometimes you might run into difficulties if you lose the perspective of where you are. So you really need to track and measure what you're doing by always signposting either the root, that flat 3, that flat 5, or the double flat 7. The first exercise we need to take a look at is the broken arpeggio exercise number 1. Again, by now you need to have had this formula memorized, and we just need to apply it over the diminished 7th structure. So what we have is that root, 3rd, 5th, then the 3rd, 5th, 7th, and so forth as we go up. But shorten this, so chunk this down to you're actually thinking like this: root, 3rd, 5th, 7, root, 3rd, root, 7, 5th, 3rd, root. And this will be much easier for you to track and measure where you are and how to apply this, especially when we're superimposing this over dominant chords. So what I want you to do is get this down. Remember, we needed to count. So counting, they'll go through all of the procedure of counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If that's a little bit too difficult, use the subdivision method. So we go 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, you can backtrack it, right back to the triplets. It might be because it's ambiguous to hear. You just want to hear it all on the beat to get it under your fingers initially. Use it as a stepping stone to get to the 16th. So we go 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4. So get this together. I want you to play this over these chord pad drones. Make sure you do this in every key. Come back and we'll work on the next exercise. Exercise is the broken arpeggio exercise number 2. Now all the same instructions apply as previously covered with the different chord types that we've already done. All we need to do is to apply this formula over the diminished 7th structure. Now remember, this exercise is the reverse of the first one. So instead of going root 3 5 to start, we start with 5 3 root. And again, to track and measure where we are, let's just think of the first note in each group. So I've got 5 here, then I go up here to 7, root, 3, 5, 7, then I go back down to 5, 3, root, 7, 5. And this way, I can really keep an eye and my ears on where I am with the chord. It's very important that a lot of this is ear training, and it has to be really focused. Again, you don't just want to go by the fingering pattern, and this reinforcement of what these chord tones are and where you are when you're playing the exercise is great while practicing. So again, we want to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If that is a little bit too difficult, use the subdivision method. 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4 E and a 1, 2, 3, 4. If you must, scale it right back to the triplets so you can hear everything on the beat. 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4. Only do that method in order to use as a stepping stone to play the 16ths. Remember what we're doing. This is rhythmic embellishment. This is so important because the rhythm of this creates such a cool embellishment that we can literally just play this with chord tones. But if I'm doing it in triplets, it no longer is an embellishment, because the embellishment is the actual 3-note groups but played in 16ths. And it sort of, creates that odd rhythmical phrasing that goes through it, and those natural accents, which are every 3 notes, and it gives it sort of a cross or polyrhythmic effect. So we mustn't forget that when we're playing these. So get this down, play this over the chord pad drone, come back, and we'll go to the next exercise. Exercise that we're going to take a look at is the diatonic approach note from above exercise. Now again, the same instructions apply as covered with the previous chord types. What we want to take a look at is the corresponding chord scale, because this is kind of unique, a little bit different than the chord scales that we've had before, because it's an 8-note scale, not a 7-note scale. In previous chord types, we've only looked at these 7-note scales. This is an 8-note scale that goes over the diminished chord, and it's called a diminished scale. And its formula, again, is symmetrical. It's of equal distance in its formula with a pattern that goes whole step, half step, all the way up to the root. So if I look at this in C, I've got C to D. Okay, that's a whole step. The half step can take me up to the E flat. Another whole step to F. Half step above that's G flat. Whole step above that is A flat. Half step above that is A natural. Whole step above that is B. And then we go to the C. Play that back down. And we have this kind of unique sounding, it's very dark sounding scale, and it's got that, you know, equal distance, and again it creates that really ambiguous sound that we're working with. So what we want to do is, again, track and measure where the chord tones are, and those notes that are in the scale but aren't in the chord, they become all of the approach notes. And what's interesting about this scale is that those notes that are left over produce another diminished chord a whole step above. So if I look at this, these are the missing notes. Those are my chord tones, those are the rest of the notes in the scale. So all of the notes here are kind of cool, because it just creates almost this double diminished effect within just the single scale. Okay, so if you look at this, again, we use the diatonic note above the first note of each group in the ascending 3-note pattern. So I've got this, the second going to the root, the fourth going to the third, the flat 6 going to the flat 5th, then the natural 7 going into that double flat 7, and the second going into the root, the 4 going into the flat 3, and then we start coming back down. Now when we come back down, this is where you might run into problems, and this is where you have to be tracking and measuring where the chord tones are, because it's a little bit of an odd fingering pattern. When we go up, it's actually okay. And remember that double-edged sword, so I don't want to get caught out. When I come back down, I'm going to be doing these little shifting motions here. So remember that this is going into the root. The next one going back down goes into the 7th. Next one going back down goes into the 5th. Next one going back down goes into the 3rd. Next one going back down goes into the root. And you need to be able to have control of that. So that's a very important concept when you're working with this diatonic approach note from above and dealing with this specific scale. So what I want you to do is practice this over the drones, come back, and then we'll get stuck into the next exercise. Exercise, what we're going to take a look at is the chromatic approach note from below exercise. Now remember, the same instructions are going to apply that we had in the previous chord types. We just need to apply this formula over this descending 3-note pattern on the diminished 7th. So we're taking the descending 3-note pattern, so we're starting from the 5th, and we're playing a chromatic from below into each one of these starting notes, which of course are chord tones. Now the interesting thing here is that all of these notes are actually diatonic to the scale. Okay, and that's kind of a cool thing. So just because it's diatonic to that diminished sound doesn't mean that it's going to sound kind of cool and outside, because it does, and this is what this diminished thing kind of gives us. So practice that slowly, take it through all the different keys, work it out over these chord pad drones, come back and we'll do the next exercise. Take a look at an exercise where we're mixing both of these concepts that we had in the last two exercises. So what we want to do is we want to play the diatonic approach note from above in an ascending fashion, and then play this in a descending way back down using the chromatic approach from below, and that gives us some cool ideas to mix this up. We've done this with the previous chord types, so let's just take a look at it over the diminished. So I'm ascending, using those diatonic approach notes from above, descending, using my chromatic ideas below. This is a great way to start mixing up these ideas. You have to do this. I want you to take this, play it through the different keys, but then start to chunk this down and play these in smaller units. Start to work this out over different chord progressions. This is what you have to do. Your imagination has to take over here with some of this stuff, and you have to actively use these ideas. The other thing is start listening for these ideas in solos or lines that you may transcribe. This is also very important, because you'll find evidence of this throughout, a lot of music. So work on this, get into this, be studious, really get it down in every key, come back and we'll do an after action review. That just about wraps up today's lesson, but before we go, let's take a look at what we've learned. In today's lesson, we've learned the importance of focusing on chord tones versus scale tones. We've also learned how the diminished seventh chord is used as a substitute superimposed over a dominant seventh chord. We've also learned how to embellish the diminished seventh chord tones both melodically and rhythmically, and how to create ready-to-use lines that you can immediately apply to your bass lines and solos over a diminished seventh chord. We've also learned how to practice these lines over dominant 7th flat 9 chord pad drones. As always, practice smart, work hard, and play creatively. I'll be checking in with you next week for Lesson 6. So until then, take care.